Good morning. Today is October 3rd, 1984, and we are in Ottawa, Canada. I'm Norman Markel from the University of Florida. The Wenner-Gren Foundation and the Department of Anthropology of the University of Florida are producing a videotape series on the history of anthropology. And today we are talking to Dr. Edgar Siskin, who came to Ottawa from Jerusalem for the Edward Sapir Centenary Conference. We are indeed fortunate to be able to share his recollections of one of the giants in the history of anthropology, Edward Sapir. Dr. Siskin, I'd like to start by asking how it was that you came to study with Edward Sapir.
I was a young rabbi in New Haven, Connecticut. It was my first pulpit. And being in New Haven, I naturally wanted to avail myself of the presence of the university and to take courses. I went to the campus and registered in the Department of Religion, the Graduate School of Religion. And I began to attend classes. But not long after I registered, I was called in by the dean of the Divinity School, and I was told that they were facing a problem. That the Divinity School had been established for the purpose of training candidates for the Christian ministry. And since most of the courses in the Department of Religion were offered in the Divinity School, I, as a rabbi, ran afoul of one of the stipulations in the charter, which allowed only for the training of candidates for the Christian ministry. And I took the hint, and I severed my relationship, or I should say my relationship with the Department of Religion was severed. Not long after that, I met Edward Sapir at a social function. We talked to each other, and he asked me about my activities in the community, and I told him of my experience in the Department of Religion with the Divinity School, and he suggested that I come to see him in his office in the graduate school with the possibility of my registering in the Department of Anthropology. And that's how I happened to become a member of the Department of Anthropology.
You saw an outstanding student.
Well, no, I'm not sure of that, but it may have been that there was something about my background which he found rather intriguing, as it was disclosed to me later on, when I realized something about the dimension in his personality, which was very much interested in the question of Jewish identity.
Let me, could you talk about what it was like to be a student of Sapir's at that time in terms of his interaction with students, his teaching style, and so on, as a person?
Sapir was by all odds the greatest teacher I ever met, I ever encountered. It was more than a learning experience to sit in a class or a seminar of Sapir's. He was the most illuminating man. David Mandelbaum, who has written a good deal about Sapir, has said that to study with Sapir was an exhilarating experience, that one left the classroom at the end of the class session feeling more than oneself. His exploration of the realm of ideas, his constant disavowal. Disavowal is not exactly what I have in mind. His constant repudiation of any recourse to jargon. He avoided the impenetrable gobbledygook which plagues so much of anthropological discourse, both its writing and its speaking. His poetic gifts, his lucidity of expression, the layered meanings in what he said, the fact that he was not only a scholar but also a poet. All of these things came through in the way he taught. His marvelous powers of articulation, his wonderful ability to mimic, which of course was particularly interesting in his courses in linguistics. He was a very simple man in his teaching methods. He would come into the classroom, he would sit down, he would smile, he would reach into an inner pocket and take out a piece of paper which was folded into 4 parts. He would open it, put it on his desk, look at it, and never refer to it again. He never used notes in his lectures. I recall the story which is told by Diamond Jeunesse, who was a curator at the National Museum after Sapir's time. Jeunesse tells the story of Sapir going into a room full of tumultuous children in the museum with 3 scraps of paper, one yellow, one black, one white, and talking about race to these children for an hour and holding them enthralled. Well, I think this is the measure of a man's ability as a teacher.
Yes, it sounds like an outstanding teacher. In graduate school today, and we hope a lot of graduate students will be watching, how, in terms of the practical problems that graduate students face, both education-wise, material-wise, living, and stuff like that, was he concerned about students, or was he aloof in that vein with students? Did he help them with their academic problems, with their personal problems, and so on?
He was the kindest of men. You could always approach Sapir on a human level. There was nothing, he placed no distance between himself and his students. All of his students liked him, admired him, and conceived a great, almost a fierce loyalty to him. He was always available. His office was never closed. I never knew him to terminate a personal interview with me, and I'm sure this was true of other students as well. Here was a man who had no sense of position. Here was a man without any pretentiousness whatsoever. He was a man, he was always genial. I never saw him angry, indignant. I can't conceive of him as being out of temper. He had a wonderful sense of humor. His lectures were full of wit, an aptness of phrase in which he could articulate with great concision a theoretical principle with a simple apothegm, usually touched with humor.
That's interesting. Well, maybe we could move into the topic of your own field work and your experiences, both with Sapir and your own work in the field.
My first field experience came about as the result of a suggestion from Sapir that I go out west and study the Washoe Indians. The Washoe were a tribe whose terrain ranges across the high Sierra Nevadas in west central Nevada and east central California. The Washoe Indians have a certain historic interest in that they were witness to the trials of the Donner Party in the 1840s. This was the party that got sequestered, stranded in the high Sierras over a winter, and are said to have practiced. Well, it's been historically attested that they engaged in cannibalism because they had no food. The Washoe actually actually came and saw, they watched members of the Donner Party, but they did not move to help them because they were afraid of the whites. The whites, the white penetration through the western frontier took place through Washoe territory, and they had learned to fear the whites. I went out to the Washoe Indians for 4 summers subsequently, and I would go there during the months of June, July, August, and a large part of September. This fit in nicely with my schedule as a practicing rabbi in New Haven, Connecticut. And Sapir was particularly interested in the Washoe because it so happens that the Washoe speak a language in the family of languages called Hokan. And Sapir had made a study of Hokan languages. But interestingly enough, the Washoe are the only Hokan-speaking tribe in the Great Basin, one of the culture areas of the country of the West. All the tribes around them speak Uto-Aztecan. And this, of course, intrigued Sapir. How did it come that this single tribe spoke a language which was different from the languages of the surrounding tribes? But I became interested in another phase of Washoe culture, namely their religion. And it so happened that while I was there, there was a religious conflict between shamanism, which is the traditional religion of the Washoe, and an intrusive religion which came into the tribe while I happened to be there. This was a fortuitous thing, and yet it presented an opportunity which is not found by many anthropologists, and a violent conflict ensued between the partisans of the shamans and shamanism on the one hand, and the devotees of peyotism and the peyote leaders on the other hand. And I was privy to this conflict, and I wrote about it. It became the subject of my doctoral dissertation, and it's also the subject of a book of mine which was published within the past year called Washoe Shamans and Peyotists, Religious Conflict in an American Indian Tribe.
That's interesting. Well, that I was going to ask you a question which perhaps you can fill in the details, because apparently I was going to ask you how that early field work. By the way, when you were in the field, we're talking what dates?
My first field trip was in 1937, and I went out there in 38, 39, and 40. And it was then that I wrote my dissertation, which was submitted in 1941. Subsequently, I went out to the Washoe with my wife, and first with my children as well. In 1965, 1974, 1981 was the last trip I made among them. And I did this in order to bring my dissertation up to date. When the University of Utah Press approached me about the possibility of publishing my work, I told them that I would be interested in having it published only if I could bring it up to date. And they agreed, and I proceeded to do this, so that the book, which was published by the University Press about a year ago, is not only a record of my initial field work in the late 1930s, but it's also an updating of Washoe religion since the time that I had written my doctoral dissertation.
So it's, the name of the book is going to be?
Is Washoe Shamans and Peyotists. And the translation of that is the subtitle of the book, Religious Conflict in an American Indian Tribe.
I wonder if, while you were talking, I didn't want to interrupt, but we mentioned Mrs. Siskin, and as if, and she is off camera, and I'd like the people to be able to see Mrs. Siskin, who was an integral part of this interview. Her presence is being felt. Who came with Dr. Siskin from Jerusalem for this conference.
Could I say something about Lillian in connection with my anthropology?
Yes.
Of course, her presence has been felt very much in my life, in all phases of it, and in this phase as well. She was a great help to me in writing this book. Of course, she was my editor, and she was also my amanuensis. She did all the typing. She's a flawless typist, by the way. In almost everything she does, she's flawless. And I'm saying this not only because she's here, but in any event, she typed the dissertation without a murmur of protest, and I think she typed 3 drafts of this rather long work.
Well, you know, this is now on tape, and we're going to send her a copy, so she'll have all this to remind you.
Okay. And I'll remind her of all the nice things I've said about her.
Okay. Okay, what I was going to ask you, and you did indicate, I'm trying to get at the relationship between your early field work starting in 1937 to here we are in 1984, and you've had a very rich and varied life, both in terms of your actual anthropological work and in terms of your personal life. Was there any, can you see the relationship of your early experiences in the field setting things that later came up to influence later things you did?
I perhaps should mention this, that after I submitted my dissertation in 41 and got my doctorate, I did some teaching at Yale. I taught courses in the anthropology of the Middle East because I had been interested in the Middle East. I had gone to Palestine for the first time in 1934, and Sapir had been my guide, so to speak, in making contacts in Palestine with the possibility of doing ethnology there. Practically no ethnology on Palestine had been done up to that time, and it was through Sapir that I was able to make contacts, not with ethnologists, of which there were none in Israel, but with archaeologists. Mm-hmm. And at that time I met Professor Eliezer Sukenik, who later became celebrated as the man who recovered the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And another point of interest, Professor Sukenik, who conducted me around the country and showed me different archaeological digs in which he had been involved. He is the father of Yigal El-Yadin, the very distinguished Israel anthropologist, archaeologist, who was responsible for the rediscovery of Matzada, and who supervised the great dig at Chatzor, and who died, I think, about a year ago. Well, I spent a considerable amount of time with Sukenik in 1934, and he encouraged me to come and do anthropology in Israel. I didn't have the opportunity of doing it for one reason, because we found ourselves in a war not long after.
Yes.
Now, in the war, I was both, at that point, I was both an anthropologist and a rabbi. And I had some problem making up my mind as to whether I would go through the war as an anthropologist or go through the war as a rabbi, that is, a chaplain.
That's interesting.
Because I did want to do something in the war to help in whatever way I could. And a good many of the Yale anthropologists went down to Columbia to enlist in the school for territorial administration, which was being established by the Navy, so that after territory was conquered or was secured by the Navy in the course of the march up the Pacific, the procession during World War II, they would take over different islands. At the same time, there was a need at that time for naval chaplains, Jewish naval chaplains. Well, I resolved the two possibilities by going into the naval chaplaincy. And I went to Williamsburg and took the course in preparation for the naval chaplaincy, which lasted for a period of 2.5 months. And then, much to my surprise, I was approached by the chief of chaplains in Williamsburg and asked if I would, how I would react to the suggestion that I become a chaplain in the Marine Corps. And I felt that I couldn't say no. It was a moment of weakness. And I became the first Jewish chaplain to be appointed to a Marine division in the South Pacific. I became the chaplain, the Jewish chaplain of the 1st Marine Division. And I went into training at Quantico, took the Marine Officers Training course, was sent out to, and then I went down to Camp Lejeune for a couple of months, and then was shipped out to the South Pacific by way of San Diego. I joined the 1st Marine Division in Noumea, New Caledonia, after they had recovered and rehabilitated in Australia after the Guadalcanal campaign, and moved up with the 1st Marine Division from Noumea, eventually to North China, where to which we were dispatched after the Okinawa campaign, after VJ Day. And of course, I was with the division for 2.5 years in the Pacific, and took part in a number of campaigns: the New Britain campaign, the Peleliu campaign in the Mariana Islands, and in the Okinawa campaign. And then went up to North China, where I stayed for 5 months before I got my orders to return to the United States. Now, during that time that I was in the South Pacific, I had the opportunity of coming in contact with the native islanders, both Polynesian and Melanesian. And my training in anthropology was very valuable in helping me to understand aspects of the native culture, aspects of native life, which we had the opportunity of encountering during our procession up the Pacific.
That's interesting. Have you ever had a chance to compare notes with your colleagues who stayed at Columbia or did the territorial thing? From what I recall from their life was more sedate in the service than it sounds yours was.
Not necessarily. I don't think that they saw combat the way we did, but I had a very interesting meeting with them in the no longer South Pacific, but in the Central Pacific. After the Okinawa campaign, after the fighting of the Okinawa campaign was ended, and it was a very sanguinary thing for the 1st Marine Division. We lost a lot of people. I was standing on a beach one day, and it was toward evening, and I see some naval characters coming ashore, and I couldn't believe my eyes. They were the people I had known at Yale. There was Murdoch, and there was Whiting, and there was Ford. And I went up to them and I said, with appropriate Marine profanity, "What are you doing here?" They looked at me and they said, responding in kind, "And what are you doing here?" They had been assigned to Okinawa to be territorial administrators of Okinawa after we had secured the island. So these are the people with whom I would have studied at Columbia had I taken the other alternative. They were in the South Pacific as well, and they stayed there for several months. And they were on other islands too in the Pacific. So their role in the Pacific may not have been quite so adventurous as mine was as a Marine Corps chaplain. Nevertheless, they saw things which were of great interest.
Very interesting.
And when I came back to New Haven, I continued teaching at the university, and I did this until in 1948, I received an invitation to take a congregation in one of the northern suburbs of Chicago, in Glencoe, Illinois. And we went there, and I remained the rabbi of that congregation, North Shore Congregation Israel, until 1972, when I retired from the active rabbinate and began a new career in anthropology. I received a teaching appointment at Northwestern University in the Department of the History and Literatures of Religion. And I taught religion, particularly Judaism, in its anthropological perspectives. I gave courses in Judaism in its cultural setting, particularly in the impact of Euro-American culture upon Judaism. And I continued teaching at Northwestern until 1976, when we decided to make the move to Israel. We had become interested in Israel. We had come here together my wife and I had come in 1955, and we decided, and we took a sabbatical in 1969, During the sabbatical, we stayed in Israel for 8 months. And at that time, we came to a decision that we would spend part of our year in Israel, part of our year in the United States. But our second son, we have 3 children, and our second son, who had been a student at the University of California in Berkeley, decided to come to Israel on Aliyah, and he did, and he became a paratrooper in the Israeli Defense Forces, and we found that we were spending more and more time in Israel. And 7 years ago, we decided that we would spend most of our year in Israel. And so we built a house in Jerusalem.
I see.
And the house is in an area called Yemin Moshe, which is near one of the landmarks of Jerusalem, the Montefiore windmill. It overlooks the Gay Hinnom, the Valley of Hinnom, and it commands an unparalleled view of the old city. The old city walls surmounted on our left hand by the Tower of David, the Migdal David, and on our right hand by Dormition Abbey, which is said to have been the site of the Last Supper.
That sounds visually great, and also that you really are excited about being there. Can you speak a little bit about the anthropology operation you're involved in and what it's like?
In 1976, we established the Jerusalem Center for Anthropological Studies, which is intended to advance and promote ethnological study in Israel and the Middle East. Israel is an unsurpassed laboratory for anthropological investigation because you find in Israel a rich diversity of cultural, ethnic, religious groups. You have Jewish communities who have come from more than 100 different countries around the world, each with its own distinctive culture. To be sure, enjoying many common elements in their culture, for all they're all Jews. Nevertheless, bringing with them local variations of their ethnic culture, which differentiate one from the other. Then you have many Arab groups. You have Bedouins. You have Druze. You have a whole variety, a whole host of Christian groups. You have Circassians. This is a rich tapestry, which is of never-ending interest to the anthropologist. And it was in order to discover more, to learn more, to investigate these different groups it was for this reason that we established the Jerusalem Center for Anthropological Studies. This was one of the purposes. Another purpose is to provide possibly some solutions to the human problems, which in many cases are intergroup in character on the Israeli scene, to assist the government, to assist the various agencies of the government, the social welfare organization of Israel, in helping the tremendous diversity of peoples that come to Israel to help them make the adjustment to the general scene. Also to record the distinctive elements in their culture before they are lost in the generalized patterns of Israeli life. We do other things in our program. We bring distinguished anthropologists from other countries to Israel. Israel is necessarily somewhat isolated,
Yes.
and the scholars of the Israeli universities, particularly those in the behavioral sciences, do not have the same opportunity of interchange with their colleagues in other countries. Travel is more difficult. The financial resources are not there. So what we do is we bring distinguished anthropologists from foreign countries to Israel so that they can meet the community of behavioral scientists, so they can give public lectures, so that they can travel around to the different universities of Israel and hold seminars, and thus make the important contacts, which are so important in the academic world and the academic confraternity of scholars. which would otherwise not be available to the Israelis. And some of the great anthropologists that we brought. Victor Turner spent a year and a half in Israel under our auspices, fell in love with the country, and taught at 3 of the universities during his period of residence in Israel. We brought Barbara Meyerhoff 2 years ago, who also had this experience of falling in love with the country, with its people, with the possibilities for anthropological investigation. We're going to bring Sir Edmund Leach there in this forthcoming year. Levi Strauss is coming to Israel.
Wow.
And so we're very pleased that we can do this. Neither the government nor the universities, unfortunately, have the resources to fund such programs. We have the resources.
I wonder if somebody would be interested in pursuing this with you, how would they get in touch with you?
They can write to our office in Jerusalem, which the address is 39 Hatikva Street, Yemin Moshe, which is the district in Jerusalem where we live, Y-E-M-I-N, capital M-O-S-H-E, Jerusalem. And the zip is 94103. Jerusalem 94103.
Good. I think maybe we take a brief break now.
Okay, fine.
Just hold on. Dr. Siskin, before we took our break, we were talking about your Institute in Anthropology in Israel, and not only as anthropologist, because you were a student of Sapir's and a linguist, I wondered if you might be able to tell us about the resuscitation of the Hebrew language.
The resuscitation of the Hebrew language is a unique phenomenon in the history of human culture. There is a word, a very long and fancy Greek word. The word is hapax legomenon. And a hapax legomenon is a word which occurs only once in Scripture. There are certain words in the Bible, in the Old Testament, which are found only once. These words are known as hapax legomenon. And the resuscitation of Hebrew as a living tongue after 2,000 years of disuse is a hapax legomenon in human culture. Attempts have been made in different countries to revive the ancient language, the most notable being Gaelic in Ireland. There has been some success, but it has not become a vernacular. It is spoken in elite circles by people devoted to the cause of Irish culture and Irish nationalism, who make a point of learning the language. And the same thing is true in some other countries. But in no country has an ancient tongue become a vernacular once more. This can be credited to certain pioneer Zionists who came to Israel and were inflamed with the idea of recreating this language. Of course, Hebrew is not just another language. Hebrew is a sacred language. And it was their purpose and their passion to restore this language to everyday use. And that is exactly what's happened. Everybody in Israel speaks Hebrew. Children play in it. Women gossip in it. And men curse in it.
Well, you know, it's interesting, Doctor, you mentioned that it was a dead language for 2,000 years, and they didn't have jet airplanes 2,000 years ago. How do you solve the problem? Do you say such and such airplane, or?
Well, there are many words in Hebrew, modern Hebrew, which are borrowed. This is true of all languages. No language can remain an island unto itself. People live in contiguous, I think the term is symbiotic relationships with one another. And there's bound to be borrowing, and this is true of all culture, not only in language, but particularly in language. The Hebrew word for airplane is aviron, or matos is another word, but aviron is another word, and this is a word which is derived from the Greek. Even in Talmudic times, in ancient Palestine 2,000 years ago, language, the Hebrew of the Talmud, which is not quite the same as the Hebrew of the Bible, has many, many borrowed terms. There's a very interesting example of this. What is the word for an axle in an automobile axle? Mm-hmm. And the word which came to be applied, came to be used in Hebrew is bekexel. So so what's the word for a front axle? Mm-hmm. The word for a front axle is a front bekexel. Yeah. So there's a wealth of borrowed words. Mencken, H.L. Mencken, in his book The American Language, in talking about Yiddish, which is another vernacular which was spoken by Jews, and before the Holocaust, before the days of World War II, Hebrew was the vernacular, was the folk expression.
Yiddish.
Yeah. Yiddish was the folk expression of the Jewish people. And H.L. Mencken has a section in his American Language devoted to American Yiddish. Yiddish has changed with the countries where it was spoken. Jews in Russia spoke a Yiddish which had many Russian words in it. Jews in France spoke a Yiddish which had many French words, and Jews in America spoke a Yiddish which had many American words in it. And it's an amazing thing that every other word in this passage that Mencken quotes is an American word. Hat gegangen zu der Window, and hat geopend the window, und hat eingelassen fresh air, and so forth, and it goes along.
I think you're speaking Yiddish, right?
Speaking Yiddish, yeah, there you are, you see. Well, I won't suggest that modern Hebrew is like that, quite the contrary. But modern Hebrew is the creation. One man's name is associated with the recreation of modern Hebrew. His name is Eliezer ben Yehuda. And Robertson John wrote a book called Tongue of the Prophets, which is a biography of Eliezer ben Yehuda. A remarkable man. He wrote the lexicon of modern Hebrew, which is both a lexicon and encyclopedia of modern Hebrew, which runs to something like 18 languages, 18 volumes. His daughter is still living in Jerusalem, and his son-in-law, who was a German converted to Judaism, was with me a member of the Jerusalem Rotary Club. I say was because I had been a member of the Jerusalem Rotary Club, but I left the club several years ago.
Dr. Siskin, I'd like to now come back to something you mentioned at the very beginning, and in talking about Edward Sapir and his interest in his Jewish identity. And I left it at that time because we were following your own personal thing. I wonder if we could get back to that topic.
Sapir came from a traditional Jewish home. His father was a cantor who served also at different times as a rabbi and as a shochet, ritual slaughterer. His home was a Jewish home in which Yiddish was spoken. His father was a man of parts, however, and as a cantor was accomplished musically. An early publication in ethnomusicology, which is the musical culture of primitive tribes, of primitive peoples, called Ceremonial Songs of the Creek and Yuchi, who are two American Indian tribes. Ceremonial Songs of the Creek and Yuchi. The musical transcriptions of this study in ethnomusicology are by Jacob Sapir, who was Edward Sapir's father. So Sapir himself was extremely musical. He was a good pianist. He was a fine composer, and in one of the letters of Ruth Benedict to, I think, Margaret Mead, she refers to the fact that some people compare Sapir's compositions with those of Richard Strauss. This may have been something of a hyperbole. Nevertheless, it says something about Sapir's knowledge of music. His knowledge of music was not that of an amateur. And I recall many allusions in his lectures in anthropology to music. He had a thorough and comprehensive knowledge of music. And incidentally, if you want to know what Sapir looked like, let me give you a brief description of his appearance. He was a man of medium height. He had black hair, which was brushed back in a pompadour. He had a prominent brow. He wore rimless eyeglasses. He usually was smiling. He was capable of laughter, sometimes enthusiastic laughter. He laughed easily. He looked like Gustav Mahler. Mm-hmm. And Gustav Mahler was, of course, a great composer. They shared this, I won't compare Sapir's musical competence with that of Mahler's. Mahler was one of the great composers of the 19th and 20th centuries. They both died at the age of 55, and they both were very much involved in the Jewish identity. Mahler was converted to Roman Catholicism because of the musical politics of the time. He would not have been able to, he would not have been appointed to the position of conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic, I think that was the name of the orchestra, had he been a Jew. And so he became converted. Looking at pictures of Mahler, I always think of Sapir, and looking at pictures of Sapir, I always think of Mahler. Sapir was brought up then in a Jewish home. He himself knew Yiddish, could speak Yiddish, and he used Yiddish not infrequently in his lectures in Semitics, writing Yiddish on the blackboard in phonetisha, that is the phonetic script. He rebelled against the strict Orthodox regime of his father's house. But he came back to an appreciation of the larger patterns that form the groundwork of Jewish life and Jewish values. Sapir never cut himself off from his people, unlike Boaz, who did not acknowledge that he was a Jew. Boaz had a problem with his Jewish identity, and he became a member of the Society of Ethical Culture, which was, of course, not Judaism, but it was a society which was very active and very prominent in New York circles, and most of whose members, of course, were Jews.
I see.
It had been founded by Dr. Felix Adler. Boaz considered himself a German American, and although he reputed the idea, the notion of ethnocentrism and chauvinism, nevertheless he made much of his German American heritage, nothing of his Jewish heritage. His face bore the saber cuts suffered in duels as a result of anti-Semitic insults which were thrown at him. He came to America as an immigrant, really escaping from the stifling intellectual atmosphere which some of his biographers have designated as such. Herskovitz, Stocking, and others speak of the fact that he left the stifling intellectual atmosphere. I translate that to be the anti-Semitic atmosphere of the American universities of which he had been a victim. He came to the United States in the year 1884, and in 1884, Edward Sapir was born. So Sapir was, he never died. He was never a hidden Jew. He was never a closet Jew. He identified himself as a Jew, and he was interested in questions of Jewish identity, in questions of Jewish personality. He had very little opportunity of doing anything about this in Ottawa, which was a backwater, and I hope there are no Ottawans listening to this. It was a
backwater in a
Jewish sense,
right?
Not in no other sense, because it was in Ottawa that Sapir laid the groundwork of his vast and his comprehensive scholarship.
Yeah. And
it was Ottawa that gave him this opportunity at the National Museum. But as far as Jewish life was concerned, Ottawa was a redoubt. It was in the backwoods. When he went to Chicago, where there was a large and active Jewish community, he identified himself with the Jewish community, not in any formal or religious sense, but as a Jew interested in Jewish questions. He became a well-known lecturer
in Chicago. Actually, about what date now we're talking about?
We're talking about 1925 to 1931. These were the years when he was at the University of Chicago.
With an appointment at the University of Chicago.
He became professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago. He became a well-known lecturer, And he gave a course of lectures in the psychology of culture. And in one of these courses, a faithful attendant was Clarence Darrow. And in one of his letters to Ruth Benedict, he says, "I've come to know Clarence Darrow quite well. Apparently their acquaintanceship o'erleaped the confines of the lecturer-listener relationship, and they must have become acquaintances, perhaps more than acquaintances, friends, because Sapir writes, and I think I quote his words, 'I have come to love the old cynic.'" So they knew each other. And he also lectured, and he debated with prominent Jewish figures on the Chicago scene on the question of Jewish identity, Jewish personality. One of them was Rabbi Solomon Goldman, who was well known, had a national reputation as an orator, a lecturer. Sapir believed, so far as Jewish identity was concerned and Jewish personality, he believed that it was an option, a viable option for the Jew to become assimilated. And he referred to the fact that Jews were becoming assimilated. He said, but this is not the only option. He said, there is no preordained option for the Jew so far as his Jewish awareness and his Jewish identity is concerned. An equally viable option is what he called the Zionist experiment. And he said Zionism has opened new vistas for many Jews, and he found that an equally acceptable option for the Jew. He himself was of a universal temper. He believed that Judaism could contribute much to the common understanding between peoples, that Judaism, because of its heritage, because of its value system, could be a leaven, a force making for a greater sense of, I'll use a religious word now, a pulpit word, a greater sense of brotherhood among peoples. But he also said, and whatever Sapir said had a kind of a sense of prescience, of foretelling. He was a man who could, as I said earlier, who could discover the direction, the drift, a favorite word of his, the drift of a culture, the drift of a society, in generalized formulations. And he said, for example, that adopting the option of assimilation was not an easy one for Jews, because there were clubs which excluded well-educated and even wealthy Jews from their membership. In other words, there was always the exclusionist impulse at work in the generalized society. And of course, he was destined to feel the sting of this himself when he went to Yale and was blackballed from the Yale Graduates Club.
He was?
Yes. And when he wrote this, of course, he wrote this in 1925, never realizing, of course, that this would happen to him. And interestingly enough, Boaz had been barred from the student associations of the universities which he attended in Germany.
Can you tell us a little more about that, the details of that incident at Yale, and actually what happened and what was Sapir's reaction to it?
Sapir was called to Yale in the year 1931. He was invited to come to Yale. He'd been very happy at the University of Chicago and wondered in some of his letters to Ruth Benedict whether he could ever bring himself to leave the campus, because he was very happy there. There was a bracing atmosphere, intellectual atmosphere, which was pervasive at the University of Chicago, and gave the widest scope to his brilliant talents as a scholar, as a teacher, and as a lecturer, as an individual. He came to Chicago, and there he encountered a much different cultural climate.
To New Haven.
Sorry, came to New Haven, and encountered a much different cultural climate. Yale was very Eastern establishment in its attitude toward Jews. It regarded Jews with caution, with a restraint, and with a discrimination which was characteristic of the Eastern establishment. Yale had a very strict, although unacknowledged, quota so far as Jewish students was concerned. There was no Jewish instructor, no Jewish faculty member at Yale College. There was a difference between Yale College and Yale University. And Yale, founded in 1702, did not appoint a Jewish member of the faculty until the year 1944. It's a long time. And there was a caste system in the Yale community, a caste system among professors. There were the landed gentry who had descended from established New England stock, and there were the commoner professors who had come from more humble origins, but who, because of their competence and their knowledge, had succeeded to the two positions of the faculty. And there were the rich professors and the poor professors. The poor professors had to live on their salaries. And Sapir was caught in this hierarchical system, of which he had been quite unaware, I'm sure, when he came to New Haven. And he would speak to me about this in a resigned and smiling ruefulness. He was never angry. He was never indignant. He never appeared to be hurt, although he may have been hurt. And he said, how could grown men occupy themselves with such kinderspiel, with such child's play? His name was proposed for membership in the Yale Graduates Club, and it was commonly accepted that a professor at Yale would be automatically accepted as a member. And Sapir was Sterling Professor of Anthropology and Linguistics. The Sterling Professorships were the most prestigious and the most remunerative on campus. And there weren't too many of them. There were few, and they were few. But by the time Sapir came to Yale, the age of 45, he had already won a national reputation. He was proposed for membership, and he was blackballed. And it was understood that he was blackballed because he was a Jew. There followed resignations. Some said from the university president himself, James Roland Angel, and other distinguished members of the faculty, to no avail. The committee stood by their decision, and Sapir was blackballed. He spoke to me about this, and as I say, he didn't appear to be hurt. He was resigned, and yet perhaps the hurt was quite deep. Franklin Edgerton, the well-known Sanskritist at Yale, who was one of those who had been outraged by Sapir's rejection, proposed Sapir for membership in the Yale Faculty Club, which was a different club. And Sapir was accepted for membership in the club. He never set foot in the club.
That's quite a moving story.
And after that, well, in 1925 and 1926, Sapir had written some articles in the Menorah Journal on the question of Jewish identity, Jewish personality. One of them was the review of a book by Ludwig Lewison, a well-known writer at the time, a book called Israel. And he sets forth his ideas on these Jewish questions in these articles. In 1915, he had written a study of Yiddish called Notes on Judeo-German Philology for the Jewish Quarterly Review, a very distinguished scholarly Jewish journal. And it remains a landmark in the study of Yiddish. Max Weinreich, who was the founder of the YIVO Scientific Institute, had come from Vilna to New Haven to study with Sapir in the famous course called Culture and Personality, which was made available at that time for young scholars around the world who had come under the sponsorship of the Rockefeller Foundation. And Max Weinreich, who was a great Yiddishist, a great Yiddish scholar and pioneer, founded this institute, which now is a very important Jewish scholarly institute, cultural institute in New York City. And Max Weinreich, about 5 years ago, wrote a book called The History of the Yiddish Language, a compendious tome in which he gives credit to Sapir for this definitive work on the history of the Yiddish language, and which I bought 5 years ago for $45, and considered it well spent because of the references in the volume made to Sapir.
Well, Dr. Siskin, I think I can't tell you how much I appreciate you spending your time with us. This information there will be very valuable, and I think students gain a great deal by looking at this. Thank you very much for being with us.
Do we have more time, a little? Or are we all
Do we have
finished?
more time with us? Sure. Yes, I think your wife is handling the people. Yes, please.
I'd like to make this valedictory statement. Benedict and Sapir had this correspondence for correspondence for 15 years, 1923 to 1938. And it's quite a remarkable correspondence because both Benedict and Sapir, who were poets, and the primary topic of their correspondence was poetry. But Sapir reveals himself in many interesting ways in his writing to Benedict. Benedict had written him that her mother, who was in her 80s, was going to Europe and going alone, and she was quite capable of doing this. And Sapir wrote her in return. It's wonderful to be on the downward slope of one's life and to be able to enjoy the prospects of what lie ahead. Sapir never had the good fortune to enjoy the prospects that lie ahead on the downward slope because he fell ill at the age of 54 and he died at the age of 55. And I would say this, that even though Sapir may not have been able to enjoy the future prospects on the downward journey, those of us who are on the downward journey can only look back and feel that it was our marvelous good fortune to have known this wonderful man who taught, who led, and who inspired us.